20th, Mr. Balcombe had intimated to me that he was appointed to supply us with what we wanted at the expense of the English government, but I wrote to inform him that as my own pecuniary circumstances enabled me to dispense with this favor, I was resolved not to avail myself of it. I therefore begged that he would obtain permission from the governor to receive from me a bill drawn on some person in England, which could not be transmitted without special permission. I wished to remain free of all obligations so that nothing might impede me in freely exercising the just and sad privilege of venting my reproaches and imprecations. The emperor rode out in the calash very early. On his return about 3 o'clock, he desired me to follow him to his chamber. I am low-spirited, unwell, and fatigued, said he. Sit down in that armchair and bear me company. He then threw himself on his couch, fell asleep, while I watched beside him. I sat within a few paces of him. His hat was uncovered, and I gazed on his brow, that brow on which were inscribed Marengo, Austerlitz, and 100 other immortal victories. What were my thoughts and sensations at that moment? They may be imagined, but I cannot attempt to describe them. In about 3 hours, about 3/4 of an hour, the emperor awoke. He took a few turns in his chamber, and he then took a fancy to visit the apartments of all the individuals of his suite. When he had minutely considered all the inconveniencies of mine, he said with a smile of indignation, "Well, I do not think that any Christian on earth can be worse lodged than you are." After dinner, the emperor attempted to read a part of the Caravanserai de Sarrazin. After glancing over a few of the tales and reading a page from one of them, he said, "The moral of this story doubtless is that men never change. This is not true. They change both to better and worse. 1,000 other maxims which authors attempt to establish are all equally false. They affirm that men are ungrateful, but no, they are not so ungrateful as is supposed, and if ingratitude be frequently a subject of complaint, it is because a benefactor requires more than he gives. It is also said that when you know a man's character, you have a key to his whole conduct, but this is a mistaken notion. A man may commit a bad action, though he be fundamentally good. He may be led into an act of wickedness without himself being wicked. This is because man is usually actuated not by the natural bent of his character, but by a secret momentary passion, which is laid dormant and concealed in the inmost recesses of his heart. Another error is to suppose that the face is the mirror of the mind. The truth is that it is very difficult to know a man's character. To avoid being deceived on this point, it is necessary to judge a person by his actions only, and it must be by his actions of the moment and merely for that moment. In truth, men have their virtues and their vices, their heroism and their perversity. Men are neither generally good nor generally bad, but they possess in practice all that is good and bad in this world. This is the principle. Natural disposition, education, and accidental circumstances are the applications. I have always been guided by this opinion, and I have generally found it correct. However, I was deceived in 1814 when I believed that France, at the sight of her dangers, would make common cause with me. But I was not deceived in 1815. On my return from Waterloo, the emperor felt unwell and retired very early, the 21st. The emperor continued indisposed, but we nevertheless took our usual airing in the calash. On our return, we were informed that the governor had been a long one and had himself arrested one of our domestics who had recently quitted the service of the deputy Governor Skelton, and who had a few days since been engaged by General Monttalon. On hearing this, the emperor exclaimed, "What turpitude! What meanness! A governor, an English lieutenant general, himself to arrest a servant? Really, this conduct is too disgusting." The Grand Marshal joined us and announced the arrival of a store ship which had left England on the 8th of March. After dinner, the Emperor asked what we would read, and we all decided for the Bible. "This is certainly very edifying," said the Emperor. "It would never be guessed in Europe." He read to us the book of Joshua, observing at almost every town or village that he named, "I encamped there, I carried that place by assault, I keep battle here." The 22nd. In course of today, a great deal was said about the sailors of the Northumberland who had been given to us as domestics and who, we now understood, were to be withdrawn from our service. They had, however, been engaged by a reciprocal contract by which both parties were bound for the space of a year. But we are without the pale of ordinary law. The governor affirmed that the admiral wanted the men, and the admiral said that he would allow them to remain with us if the governor pleased. The sailors were taken away, and soldiers were sent in their stead. But these were also removed and sent back again, ordered away a second time, and again sent back to us. We were unable to guess the meaning of all these changes while I was in the Emperor's apartment waiting for the announcement of dinner. The conversation fell on Madame Campan's establishment, the young persons who had been educated in it, and the fortunes which the Emperor had conferred on some of them. He was particularly alluding to Stephanie de Beauharnais, afterwards Princess of Baden, to whom he said he was much attached. He entered into many details respecting her. Princess Stephanie of Baden lost her mother in her childhood. She was left in the care of an English lady, her mother's intimate friend, who was very rich and without children, and who confided the education of her protégée to some old nuns in the south of France, I believe at Montauban. Napoleon, during his consulship, one day heard Josephine mention this circumstance while alluding to her young relation Stephanie. "How can you permit this?" said he. "How can you suffer one of your name to be supported by a foreigner, an Englishwoman, who must at this moment be regarded as our enemy? Are you not afraid that your memory will one day suffer by this?" A courier was immediately dispatched to bring the young lady to the Tuileries, but the nuns refused to part with her. Napoleon, however, instituted the necessary legal forms, and a second courier was speedily sent to the prefect of the district with orders instantly to seize the person of the young lady in the name of the law. Owing to the circumstances at the time, such was the influence of certain systems of education and of the opinions which they inspired, that Stephanie's removal was to herself a source of deep regret, and she beheld not without terror him who declared himself her relative and who was about to become her benefactor. She was placed in the establishment of Madame Campan at Saint-Germain. All sorts of masters were appointed to superintend her education, and on her introduction to the world, her beauty, wit, and accomplishments and virtues rendered her an object of universal admiration. The Emperor adopted her as his daughter and gave her in marriage to the hereditary Prince of Baden. The union was for several years far from being happy. In course of time, however, the causes of difference gradually vanished. The prince and princess became attached to each other, and from that moment they had only to regret the happiness of which they had deprived themselves during the early years of the marriage. At the conferences of Erfurt, the Princess of Baden received most marked attentions from her brother-in-law, the Emperor Alexander. During our disasters in 1813, persons who were at the head of political affairs, dreading the result of an interview between Alexander and the Princess of Baden at Mannheim, succeeded in depriving the princess of the regard of her august relative by circulating false reports to the prejudice of her character. Thus, when Alexander arrived at Mannheim and his triumphal march to Paris, he by no means treated Princess Stephanie with due respect. His conduct was calculated to wound her feelings, but he could not humble her pride. On this occasion, the conduct pursued by the Prince of Baden reflected true glory in his character. The most august personages surrounded him and urged him to repudiate the wife whom he had received from the hands of Napoleon. But the prince, with true nobleness of sentiment, rejected the idea, observing that he would never commit an act of baseness which would be as repugnant to his affections as to his honor. This generous prince, to whom we did not render sufficient justice in Paris, afterwards fell a victim to a tedious and painful illness. The princess personally attended on her husband throughout the whole of his sufferings, performing with her own hands all the minute services that his situation required. Her devoted attachment gained for her the admiration of her relatives and subjects. Princess Stephanie of Baden shed a luster over her exalted station. She conferred honor on her character as a wife and a daughter, she at all times professed the highest veneration for him, who, when in the enjoyment of boundless power, had benevolently adopted her as his child. The 23rd, the emperor desired me to attend him in his chamber. About 2:00, he remarked that I did not look well. He was himself ill and had had but little sleep during the preceding night. He began addressing that he should probably feel better when he finished his toilet. We then went out to walk in the garden. The turn of the conversation led the emperor to remark that our manners required that a sovereign should be regarded only as the blessing of his people. His acts of severity must be overlooked in consideration of his acts of clemency. Mercy must still be held to be his chief attribute. In Paris, he observed, he had sometimes been reproached for conversations and words which, in truth, ought not to have escaped him. But he added that his personal situation, his extreme activity, and most of his acts, which really proceeded from himself, ought to have made amends for many things. He rendered justice to the delicate tact which distinguished the inhabitants of the French capital. Nowhere, he said, could be found so much wit or more taste. He reproached himself for the expulsion of Portalis from the Council of State. I, who was present at the scene, told him that I thought his manner was somewhat paternal. I was perhaps too severe, resumed he. I should have checked myself before I ordered him to be gone. He attempted no justification, and therefore the scene should have ended merely by my saying, "It is well." His punishment should have awaited him at home. Anger is always unbecoming in a sovereign, but perhaps I was excusable in my counsel, where I might consider myself in the bosom of my own family, or perhaps, after all, I may be justly condemned for this act. Everyone has his fault. Nature will exert her sway over us all. He said that he also reproached himself for his conduct to Monsieur de G at the Tuileries during one of the grand Sunday audiences, and in the presence of all the court. But in this instance, said he, I was provoked to the utmost extreme. My anger burst forth against my inclination. I had given G the command of a legion of the capital, which I was about to defend. I afterwards learned that he rejoiced in our disasters and invoked them. Though I did not know this at the period at which I'm now alluding, the enemy was advancing upon us, and G coolly wrote to inform me that his health would not permit him to take the command, though as a courtier he presented himself to me in perfect activity and good spirits. I was very indignant at his conduct, but I repressed my anger and resolved to take no notice of him. He, however, on 3 or 4 occasions saw an opportunity of throwing himself in my way. I could no longer stifle my rage, and the bomb exploded. I omit the rest of the story, it's too long, but concluded the emperor, what distressed me most of all was the situation of G's son, who was my chamberlain, of whom I had no reason to complain. The emperor then spoke of the Faubourg Saint-Germain and questioned me respecting many families and individuals belonging to it. He happened to mention the name of Madame de S. I observed that she had constantly evinced great attachment to the emperor, for which she was now doubtless severely punished. The emperor was not aware of the extent and sincerity of her zeal and devotedness, though he had been very much moved by her generous resolution of remaining with the Empress Josephine. He had, he said, to reproach himself for not having done anything for Madame de S. She must have been unfortunate in the choice of the moment at which she solicited her husband's nomination to the Senate. I had from my childhood been intimately acquainted with Madame de S, and she made me her confidential friend. I related to the emperor the anecdote of her nomination to the post of Dame du Palais. Her husband one morning introduced her to the Empress Josephine, who returned her thanks for having made an application to enter into her service. This was a thunderbolt to Madame de S, who had never dreamed of making such a solicitation, and who, in the natural timidity of her disposition, preferred silence and reserved it. At that time, I was certainly far from approving or advising her acceptance of the post, but I nevertheless rendered her a real act of service by withholding a letter of refusal which she had confided to me without the knowledge of her friends, and which might have proved fatal to the intrigues of those by whom the affair had been brought about. The emperor asked me what could have given rise to this repugnance on the part of Madame de S to enter the service of the Empress. I replied that it was occasioned by the connection she had had with the royal family. She was right, said he. How could her husband think of placing her in a situation so hostile to her feelings? A similar case occurred in one of my nominations to chamberlains. One individual begged that I would be pleased to allow him to decline the honor because, as he said, He had been first gentleman of the chamber to Louis XVI and Louis XVIII. This was perfectly reasonable on his part, but how could I possibly listen to such a solicitation? It was proof of want of delicacy in those who proposed this nomination. But what had I to do with that? Could I enter into details of this kind? The important affairs that claim my attention would not permit me to descend to matters of this sort. However, continued the Emperor, if Madame de S had gone the right way to work, she might have obtained all she asked for, but she never evinced any particular interest in what she solicited and made applications only in favor of individuals who had not proved themselves very deserving. Among others, she recommended my notice a man who, after being one of the king's peers, wished to be made one of mine. On my return from Elba, the daughter came to assure me that if I would confer this favor upon him, he would pledge himself to act with zeal in my service, acknowledging, as he said, no interests but those of the nation. All this was, of course, fair enough. About 4 o'clock, the Emperor got into the calash. During our usual ride, he mentioned several serious accidents by which, at one time or other, his life had been endangered at St. Cloud. He once wished to drive his calash, 6 in hand. The horses were startled by aide-de-camp Caffarelli inadvertently crossing the road in front of them before the Emperor had time to recover the reins. The horses set off at full speed, and the calash, which rolled along with extreme velocity, struck against a railing. The Emperor was thrown out to the distance of 8 or 10 feet and lay stretched on the ground with his face downwards. He was, he said, dead for a few seconds. He felt the moment at which life became extinct, which he called the negative moment. The first individual of the suite who alighted immediately revived him by a touch. He observed that the mere contact suddenly restored him to life, as in the nightmare the sufferer is relieved as soon as he can utter a cry. On another occasion, the Emperor said he had nearly been drowned when in garrison at Auxonne in 1786. While he was one day amusing himself with swimming, a sudden numbness came over him. He lost his self-possession, and being alone, he was carried along by the current in a senseless state. He felt life escape him, and even heard his comrades on the shore call out that he was drowned, and hasten in quest of boats to drag for his body. In this case, a sudden shock restored him back to life. His breast struck against a sandbank, and by a miracle, his head being above the water, he recovered himself sufficiently to swim ashore. The water dislodged itself from his stomach. He regained the spot where he had left his clothes, and having dressed himself, he got home, while his friends were still in search of his body. Another time, while hunting the wild boar at Marly, all his suite was put to flight. It was like the rout of an army. The Emperor, Soult, and Berthier maintained their ground against 3 enormous boars. We killed all 3, but I received a hurt from my adversary and nearly lost this finger, said the Emperor, pointing to the 3rd finger of his left hand, which indeed bore the mark of a severe wound. But the most laughable circumstance of all was to see the multitude of men surrounded by their dogs, screening themselves behind the 3 heroes and calling out lustily, "Save the Emperor! Save the Emperor!" while not one advanced to my assistance. 24th. The Emperor went out only to take an airing in the calash. We drove for nearly an hour and a half, proceeding at a slow pace, and we lengthened our airing by going twice over the limits of our usual ride. The Emperor conversed on politics. The newspapers, which we had received 3 days ago, furnished the subject of discussion. In France, he observed, the patriots were emigrating rapidly, and there seemed to be a wish to encourage the emigration. From the circumstances of their property not having been confiscated, the Emperor thought he could perceive from the debates in English Parliament that there was a reserved idea respecting the division of France, that this was a severe shock to his feelings. Everyone possessing a true French heart, said he, must now be overwhelmed in despair. An immense majority of the population of France must be plunged into the deepest sorrow. Ah, he exclaimed, why am I not placed in some remote sphere, on a soil truly free and independent, where no external influence could be dreaded? How would I astonish the universe? I would address a proclamation to the French. I would say to them, you are lost if you are not united. The odious, the insolent foreigner is about to parcel you out and to annihilate you. Frenchmen, arise, make common cause at all hazards, rally. If it must be so, him and around the Bourbons. Let the existence and safety of France take place of every other consideration. He thought, however, that Russia must oppose this division, as she would thereby have to fear the growing strength and consolidation of Germany against her. Someone present remarked that Austria must oppose it also from the apprehension of wanting the necessary support in case of any attempts on the part of Russia. It was moreover observed that in such a case Austria might probably serve the cause of the King of Rome by sending him forward. Yes, replied the emperor, as an instrument of menace, perhaps, but never as the object of her good wishes. Austria must have too much cause to dread him. The King of Rome will be the man of the people. He will be the champion of Italy. Thus it will be the policy of Austria to take his life. This will not probably be attempted during the reign of his grandfather, who is a good man, but the Emperor Francis cannot live forever. If, however, the manners of the present age should preclude the possibility of an attempt to murder him, they will endeavor to brutalize his faculties, or finally, if he should escape both physical and moral assassination, if his mother's cares and his own natural endowments should rescue him from all these dangers, then, he repeated several times as if absorbed in reflection, why then, but who can calculate on the destinies of anyone? The emperor then turned the conversation to England by remarking that she alone was interested in the destruction of France and in the plenitude and versatility of this fancy. He touched on all the various plans which she was likely to adopt for that purpose. She could not increase the power of Belgium, he said, otherwise Antwerp would become as formidable to her as it had been under his reign. She must, he observed, leave the Bourbons in the center, with only 8 or 10 millions of inhabitants to surround them with princes, dukes, or kings of Normandy, Brittany, Aquitaine, and Provence, so that Cherbourg, Brest, Garonne, and the Mediterranean would be in the possession of different sovereigns. Thus, he said, would make the French monarchy retrograde several ages, would restore it to its situation under the first Capets, and would provide for the Bourbons a few centuries of new and laborious efforts. But fortunately, observed the emperor, before England can arrive at this point, she will have to surmount almost invincible obstacles: the uniformity of the division of the territory in departments, the similitude of language, the identity of manners, the universality of the code, the generality of my lyceums, and the glory and splendor which I have left behind me. These are so many indissoluble knots in truly national institutions. A great nation like France cannot easily be parceled out, or if it should, it will be constantly reuniting and seeking to recover its importance, like Ariosto's giant, who runs after his limbs and even his head as they are lopped off, and after putting them on begins to fight again. But sire, said someone present, the power of the giant depended on the plucking out of a single hair, and in like manner Napoleon may be said to be the hair on which depended the existence of France. No, resumed the emperor, my memory and my ideas would still survive. But, continued he, England, on the contrary, would in course of time have become a mere appendage to France, had the latter continued under my dominion. England was by nature intended to be one of our islands, as well as Oleron or Corsica. On what trifles does the fate of empires depend? How petty and insignificant are our revolutions in the grand organization of the universe! If instead of entering upon the Egyptian expedition, I had invaded Ireland, if some slight derangement of my plans had not thrown obstacles in the way of my Bologna enterprise, what would England have been today? What would have been the situation of the continent and the whole political world? The 25th. After dinner, the emperor read Oedipus, which he admired exceedingly. He next took up Brutus, of which he gave us a very remarkable analysis. He observed that Voltaire seemed not to have entered into the right feeling for his subject. The Romans said he were guided by patriotism, as we are by honor. Voltaire has not betrayed the real sublimity of Brutus, sacrificing his sons for the welfare of his country, and in spite of the pangs of paternal affection, he has made him a monster of pride, decreeing the death of his children for the sake of preserving his power, his name, and his celebrity. The other characters of the tragedy, he added, are equally misconceived. Tullia is described as a fury who takes advantage of her situation, and not as a woman of tender sentiment who might be led into crime by seduction and dangerous influence. The 26th, the Emperor sent for me about 2 o'clock. He was not well and was much fatigued. We looked over the newspapers. In these papers, it was stated that Joseph Bonaparte had made extensive purchases of land on the north of the state of New York, on the river St. Lawrence, and that a great number of French families had grouped round him and were soon likely to form a numerous colony. It was remarked that the spot seemed to have been fixed on with a view to the interests of the United States and in opposition to the policy of England. In the South, in Louisiana, for example, the refugees could have looked forward only to the enjoyment of repose and domestic happiness. But in their present situation, they must soon naturally become objects of attraction to the population of Canada, which was already French. And they must ultimately form a strong barrier or even a hostile point against the English, who yet possess the domination of that part of America. The Emperor said that the establishment would in a few years present a numerous population distinguished for all sorts of useful knowledge. If they do their duty, said he, they will transmit from their colony excellent writings, victorious refutations of the system which now triumphs in Europe, when at the time of Elba, the Emperor had entertained a similar idea. He then proceeded to calculate all that he had given to the different members of his family and observed that they might have amassed considerable sums of money. For his part, he said he had nothing. If, in course of time, he might find himself in possession of any property in Europe, he should be wholly indebted for it to the foresight and contrivance of some of his friends. If the Emperor had gone to America, he intended to have collected all his relatives around him, and he supposed that they might have realized at least 40 millions of francs. This point would have become the nucleus of a national union, a second France. Before the conclusion of a year, the events of Europe would have collected around him 100 millions of francs and 60,000 individuals, most of them possessing wealth, talent, and information. The Emperor said he should have liked to realize that dream, and it would have been the renewal of his glory. America, continued he, was in all respects our proper asylum. It is an immense continent, possessing the advantages of a peculiar system of freedom. If a man be troubled with melancholy, he may get into a coach and drive 1,000 leagues, enjoying all the way the pleasure of a common traveler. In America, you may be on a footing of equality with everyone. You may, if you please, mingle with the crowd without inconvenience, retaining your own manners, your own language, and your own religion. He said it was impossible he could henceforth consider himself as a private man in Europe. His name was too popular throughout the continent. He was in some way or other connected with every people and belonged to every country. As for you, said he to me, smiling, your fate seems naturally to lead you to the shores of the Orinoco or to Mexico, where the recollection of the goodless causes is not yet obliterated. You would there have enjoyed all you could have wished. The destinies of some men seem to be marked out. Gregoire, for instance, has only to go to Haiti, and he would immediately be made a pope. At the time of the Emperor's second abdication, an American in Paris wrote to him as follows: while you were at the head of a nation, you could perform any miracle you might conceive, any hopes, but now you can do nothing more in Europe. Fly to the United States. I know the hearts of the leading men and the sentiments of the peoples of America. You will there find a second country and every source of consolation. The Emperor would not listen to such suggestion. He might doubtless, by dint of speed or disguise, have gained Brest, Nantes, Bordeaux, or Toulon, and in all probability have reached America, but he conceived that either disguise or flight would be derogatory from his dignity. He thought himself bound to prove to all Europe his full confidence in the French people and their extreme attachment to him by passing through his dominions at such a crisis merely in the quality of a private man and unattended by any escort. But what above all influenced him at that critical moment was the hope of impending dangers would open the eyes of his subjects, that they would rally around him, and that he might save the country. This hope caused him to linger at Malmaison and to postpone his departure after he had reached Rochefort. If he is now at St. Helena, he owes his captivity to the sentiment of which he was unable to divest himself subsequently, when he had no other resource than to accept the hospitality of the Bellerophon. It was not perhaps without a feeling of inward satisfaction that he found himself, by the force of circumstances, irresistibly led to fix his abode in England, where he might enjoy the happiness of being still but little removed from France. He was well aware that he could not be free in England, but he hoped to be heard, and then a chance would at least have been open to the impressions which he might create. The English ministers, said he, who are the enemies of their country, and who have sold her to foreigners, though they had too much cause to dread my presence. They conceived that my opinion in London would be more powerful than the whole opposition, that it would have compelled them either to change their system or resign their places. And to keep themselves in place, they basically sacrificed the true interests of their country. The triumph, the glory of her loss, the peace of the world, the welfare of Europe, the happiness, and the benedictions of posterity. In the course of conversation during the evening, the emperor once more adverted to Waterloo and described his anxiety and indecision before he came to a final resolution respecting his abdication. I passed over a multitude of details lest I should be led into repetition. I note down only the following. The emperor's speech to his ministers was the literal prophecy of all that subsequently took place. Carnot was the only one who seemed to take a right view of the case. He opposed the abdication, which he said was a death blow to France. And he wished that we should defend ourselves, even to annihilation. Carnot was the only one who maintained this opinion. All the rest were for the abdication. That measure was determined, and Carnot, covering his face with his hands, burst into tears.